Early on Wednesday, just a couple of hours before I recorded this podcast, we all learned of the unfortunate death of Bruno Sammartino. And this one was huge. This was a big loss for the wrestling world. This is an Andre the Giant level death right here. Bruno, I believe, was 82 and he was ill. And for those of you who might be young, might be in your 20s, might be a teenager, might not be too familiar with Bruno Sammartino, let me just kind of run down how ridiculously important this guy was. First of all, notwithstanding his remarkable career, he was just a truly genuine man's man. I mean, he always carried himself with the utmost dignity. He had nothing but respect from his peers, his colleagues, every promoter that he worked for. He was just a stand-up, genuine man, and he had a hell of a life. I mean, he grew up with multiple siblings, many of which died. His family had to hide from German soldiers, at the tail end of World War II. And when he finally got over here to the United States and eventually found himself working in Vince Sr.'s territory in the New York area and becoming the heavyweight champion, I mean, he really kicked everything off for the WWF. Their first champion ever was Buddy Rogers. He only held that title for about 3 weeks, and then Bruno would defeat him, I think, in less than a minute and go on to hold that title for, get this, nearly 8 years. Bruno Sammartino was on top. He was the world champion of the New York territory, and there was nobody in the wrestling world, past, present, or future, that was as over as that guy was, especially in Madison Square Garden. You go back and you look at matches and footage from the 60s and early 70s of Bruno Sammartino. Back then, there was no theme music, there was no Titantrons, there was no flashy entrances, no catchphrases, no flashy outfits, no sparkles. Bruno came out there as Bruno Sammartino in a pair of trunks and a pair of boots to no music, and the crowd was as organically loud as you will ever hear in the history of the business. I mean, this guy got stone cold Steve Austin level pops every single night he performed, and the glass never even had to shatter. The fans just enjoyed seeing him. He was their hero. He was one of the biggest baby faces that has ever stepped foot into a wrestling ring, especially in that Northeast territory, to the point where when Ivan Koloff beat him for the belt, they had to be careful how they structured that and get Ivan the hell out of there, because a riot was legitimately possible. It's not like today, if Roman Reigns wins, we riot. No. These people were serious, and there was a serious threat of rioting. Nowadays, fans can hold up as many signs as they want and scream and yell as loud as they want. We know that they're not going to be jumping in that ring and rioting. Ain't going to happen. But back in the day, it was a very real possibility. And people took wrestling much more seriously back then, and the heels had heat and the baby faces were over, and it was just such a glorious and simpler time. When Ivan Koloff, who used to be my neighbor, by the way, I used to know Ivan Koloff when I lived in North Carolina. He was the guy that ended that long reign. Now, he would cough the belt up shortly after that to Pedro Morales, who would have a long run of his own. But to end that long streak of Bruno, you had thousands of literally enraged fans because of how emotionally invested they were in Bruno and his run. It's not like today. You didn't hear anybody saying, Ivan Koloff shouldn't have been the guy to beat Bruno and end his streak. They should have given it to a younger guy, and all that stupid shit you hear today. It just was a completely different business back then. And had it not been for Bruno really putting the WWF on the map, because when they introduced their own title in 1963, I mean, Bruno was the guy that, for the first 8 years really carried that company. Without Bruno, without his run, without the success he had working for Vince's dad, I dare say there is a chance that the WWE would not exist today. It may not have lasted long enough for Vince Sr. to sell it to Vince Jr. Vince maybe would have gotten into the wrestling business, but WWF might have been a failed experiment, and maybe Vince would have to start his own company and call it something else. So the fact that Vince was able to buy it, and we got into the Hulk Hogan era and the rock and wrestling era, into the Attitude era, into what we see today, and this long evolutionary process that transformed the business from what we saw back then into what we see today, none of this would be even close to possible had it not been for the career of Bruno Sammartino in the WWF. I do Q&As a lot. You guys know that. I've done many Q&As over the years, and I would say probably one of the most common questions that I get is, what is my Mount Rushmore of wrestling talent? Now, that's debatable. Everybody can have a different Mount Rushmore. You can make arguments for any guy, lots of different guys. You can leave some guys off. You can put some guys on. But no matter what you do, there's one guy that can't be touched, and that's Bruno Sammartino. He had a fascinating life. He had a fascinating career, and he was arguably the greatest champion this business has ever seen. And you can feel it. Young people, go online right now, go on YouTube, and just look up some old Bruno Sammartino matches, some big matches that he had in Madison Square Garden, big title defenses. A lot of that footage is grainy and tough to see, but you can still feel the energy. That crowd, how loud they would be to a guy simply walking out there with no music and no bullshit, and the roof is literally exploding. That is energy that you just simply cannot create today in 2018. And Bruno was in the perfect territory for that. There is a huge Italian-American population in the Northeast, and Bruno coming in like that and having that success, it was a success story. Those fans could look up to him. He was their hero. It was the true American dream. Bruno lived it. Being able to survive what he did in his childhood and come over here and become such a huge star. I mean, it's an amazing story, and it's an incredible story. And one of the best things about Bruno is just what an awesome man he truly was. He didn't have a shit ton of problems. He wasn't jacked full of steroids. He wasn't addicted to drugs. He didn't beat his wife. He was just all the way up until the end. You saw him in interviews, even as an old man, just so respectful. And it always wasn't like that with Bruno. I mean, Bruno just recently, in the last 5 years, mended fences with Vince McMahon and the WWE. He was very outspoken about the product. He had the fallout with Vince in the 80s. A lot of that was centered around the steroid allegations. There was the big talk show Donahue. I think Bruno might have been a part of that, or Larry King Live, one of those shows. Bruno was very outspoken against WWE, but he always had his standards. He always had his reasons. Bruno never came off like Superstar Billy Graham did. Superstar Billy Graham comes off as a bitter, jaded asshole. And Bruno never came off that way. Even when he was very harsh and outspoken against WWE, he had good arguments. Bruno wasn't making this shit up out of thin air, out of bitterness or out of anger or jealousy. He legitimately believed that some of the things that WWE was doing was evil and wrong. And he stood up and he said so. And he did not have a good relationship with Vince Jr. And he was there in WWE, I think all the way up until, I'd say, early 88. So he was with the company there all the way through the first 3 WrestleManias, and then things went downhill, and then he became very outspoken. But as years went on, and WWE evolved, and they changed, and Triple H took more of a role in the company, and they started changing their direction to be more kid-friendly, fan-friendly, TV PG. They really changed their image a lot to where when they reached out to Bruno, he was actually willing to listen. Triple H kind of brokered the whole deal. He got Bruno and Vince together. They had a meeting, they made up, and they were able to put Bruno Sammartino in the Hall of Fame in New York City, which is the perfect place. And I'm so happy that we at least had that happy ending with Bruno, and he was able to kind of mend these fences. And now he's come in, up until his death, he was coming in doing several things for WWE. He would do random appearances. I know he's on a Table for Three, I think, on the WWE Network. And that always just brought such a huge smile to my face, because I said for years that you cannot even consider the Hall of Fame legit until Bruno goes in. There's other guys like Owen Hart and Randy Savage that maybe the situations are just a little bit weird, but it can't be legitimized until Bruno is in. You can't sit here and pretend to have a Hall of Fame and not have your godfather of your championship belt, the guy that got the whole ball rolling for the first 8 years of the WWF's existence, and not have him in the Hall of Fame, what he meant to wrestling, what a big star he was. And it always did rub me the wrong way. And it bothered me that not only Vince, but Bruno too, could not let anything go or come back together. So the fact that that finally happened in 2013, for me as a wrestling fan, I was so happy to see that. And it was really the first time that I ever considered the WWE Hall of Fame even close to legitimate. It's still very much bullshit how they decide who goes in and who doesn't. But as far as the major names, the names that you would expect to be in a Hall of Fame to really make it real, Bruno was on the top of that list. So once he got in, I felt a lot better about WWE actually having this Hall of Fame. Bruno lived a very long and happy and fulfilling life. He is a success story in wrestling, especially when it comes to wrestling deaths. Although this is a very sad death and one that we should mourn, this isn't one of those deaths that we feel angry about or frustrated. Bruno didn't die under any sort of suspicious circumstances. He was 82 and he was in the hospital and he passed away. And he was just a stand-up man's man, and I have the utmost respect for Bruno Sammartino and his career. Rest in peace to a true legend. As far as significance goes, I would put this guy over Andre, over Hogan, over Stone Cold Steve Austin. All of those guys were very big parts of their era. Bruno got the ball rolling in WWE. Without him, there might not be a WWE today. Hogan took over in the 80s and really blasted them off to the next level. And then Stone Cold Steve Austin saved WWE from WCW's wrath. Right when WWE is on the ropes and on the verge of going out of business, Stone Cold Steve Austin shows up and changes the whole business. But even above those three guys, I still think none of it would happen without Bruno. So he is number one on my Mount Rushmore, and probably the most significant name as far as WWE goes that we've ever had. So it's a sad day, and as an old school fan, this is a death that makes me very, very sad, but also very, very proud of what a career that Bruno had and what a great man he truly was. So rest in peace, Bruno Sammartino.